Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I'm Jamie Muller, and this is the Grad Connection, where my whole point and whole goal here is to try to help graduate students do more than survive. I want to see you thrive by helping you navigate the policies, process, and politics of graduate education. So we've been doing the research series here for quite some time. I don't remember which number this is, but we're going to talk about methodology today. I am releasing this a little bit earlier in the week. I'm going to be going later in the week, so I want to get this done. So a couple things first off about the methodology. First of all, it's typically chapter 3 in what I would call the traditional dissertation, where chapter 1 is an introduction, chapter 2 is a literature review, chapter 3 is methodology, chapter 4 is data, chapter 5 is summary and conclusions, plus or minus some chapters. If you're doing an article-based dissertation, you're going to have small methodology sections in each of the little chapters because each of the chapters is a paper that you've published. Either way, you have to deal with the methodology. So, but I would say as it relates to like the proposal, what I typically try to advise students, and typically when I would teach research methods and the students would be developing their proposal in that class, oftentimes I would tell them to try to develop as much as is possible in chapter 3 relative to the method as they were creating their proposal. Now, I will say that's probably what I would call the squishiest part of the proposal in most cases, because oftentimes when a student is developing their thesis proposal, their dissertation proposal, they haven't formally met with the entire committee necessarily. And the parts of the methodology kind of solidify after you get the committee together in the proposal meeting where everybody's kind of agreeing to what you're actually doing and actually how you're going to do it. So realize this. I would it's kind of like throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. I would actually create in your chapter 3 relative to your method, try to provide as much detail as possible. I'll also say that the composition of chapter 3 varies depending on the type of research that you're doing. So as I talk through the rest of this video, I'm going to provide it like in all 3 frames. And just as a reminder, kind of the way that I break this out is I generally would say there are 3 types of research: quantitative research, qualitative research, and what I affectionately call things and stuff. So quantitative research would basically be where you're reducing everything to numbers, and oftentimes you're using statistical tools to try to make an inference about a population using a sample. But there are other derivations of quantitative research. But that's kind of my background, the type of research that I'm used to. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is where you're working with human subjects. And really the thing that you're measuring are words. You're talking about, what are the stories people tell? How do they use words? What are the meanings of those words? If you were to try, and again, keep in mind that typically with quantitative research, we're trying to test theory. Qualitative research, we're typically trying to generate theory. And so those are kind of 2 things that go hand in hand. And then there's this third category of research that I talk about, that I call things and stuff research. This is more of like use-inspired or applied types of research projects, but essentially you're creating a thing or a stuff. It could be algorithm, it could be hardware, it could be an apparatus, it could be something. Typically it's something physical, and I say physical, it could also be electronic, I suppose, if you're talking about software and algorithms, but nevertheless, things and stuff, you're developing something, and you're testing it under certain conditions. Oftentimes it's just, does it work or not work? Does it hit the mark or not hit the mark? It's not like you do multiple samples. It's not like you do multiple takes, if you will. Versus quantitative and qualitative research, you're oftentimes doing multiple measures, and then trying to summarize those measures in a things and stuff environment. It's like the thing either works or it doesn't work under the conditions that you've specified. So those are kind of the 3 categories of research, the way I break it up, and then you can slice and dice this lots of different ways. But to try to simplify things, we'll leave it at that. So generally, chapter 3 has some specific sections, right? I'm going to talk through these. First would be acknowledgement of the type of research that you're doing, or what I'll call framework, and I'll describe that more. The sources of the data that you're going to collect, the procedures or how you're going to collect that data, the analysis of the data, how you're going to analyze it, and then lastly, kind of this section of targets, or how are you going to know that you've arrived? In other words, when you do research, you've created a research question that tells where you're going, right? What's planned, what you're trying to develop, what you're trying to provide support for relative to where you're going. But you have to have a target, right? Like how do you know that you've accomplished something in your research? And I'm not talking about whether you've actually found something to be true or not, or found support for something, right? The effect that, if you're trying to do research and trying to find a specific thing, I'm not talking about whether you found that it's true or not true. What I'm talking about is, how do you know that you found something, whatever that something is? And that's when I talk about targets and findings. That's what I'm talking about. And I'll describe more of that as we go. So let's go back. So type of research, usually this is, obviously this is usually acknowledged in the introductory chapter. That is chapter 1. You usually give some vague reference about whether this is going to be quantitative or qualitative. I would say even if you don't make that the vague references, should be able to tell from the research question kind of likely how you're going to be researching this. Second would be the framework. So what do I mean by framework? So in a quantitative, statistically oriented kind of quantitative study, this is a typical, like, what's the process going to be? Is it going to be like pre-test, intervention, post-test? Is it going to be post-test only? And so it's essentially what we're talking about. Is, kind of how are you structuring the research generically? And there are quantitative frameworks that are typical. There are also qualitative frameworks that are typical. And so when I talk about a qualitative framework, I would be talking about, like, are you doing a biography? Are you doing ethnography? Are you doing grounded theory? Are you doing case study? Are you doing phenomenology? So when I talk about framework, that's what I'm talking about in qualitative state. And then in things and stuff, it would be basically, usually it's a general description of the apparatus or thing that you're developing, possibly the environment that you're going to test it in, or the conditions under which you're going to test it. But most importantly, it's usually the tech details, right, about this thing. And so it's usually an expository of all the nuances of that thing. So that's the framework. Talking about sources of data. So chapter 3 typically will acknowledge the sources of data. In a quantitative sphere, that's typically going to include, what is the population that you're trying to infer to? What's the sample? In other words, how, and including sample size, what's the size of the sample that you're going to try to garner, as well as maybe some general things about the environment. Let's say I was doing educational research, and I want to be able to infer to all middle school children in the United States. My sample is going to be from a specific school. And then I may talk about the environment, like, what are the, if it were here in Indiana, it'd be, talking about Midwest, blah, 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 right? So giving descriptions about where that data is going to come from. In a qualitative state, you do talk about sample, but what I would say is, there's a significant difference between quantitative samples and qualitative samples. Quantitative samples, you could have hundreds, thousands. In a qualitative environment, it's usually a small number, right? And so when we talk about that, we talk about qualitative sampling, and maybe, in a biography, it's a sample of 1. But usually it's, 12 to 15 when you're talking about some of the other types of things like ethnography, grounded theory, case study, those kinds of things. And then lastly, with with things and stuff, usually you're talking about, what are the technical measures, the technical devices that you're going to use to measure with. You may talk about, the accuracy of those devices in this section. But nevertheless, you talk about where your data is coming from. Procedures for collecting data. In quantitative research, you would talk about, how are you going to get access to the sample? What are the instruments that you're using? Are you using surveys? Are you using exams? Are you using whatever it is that you're measuring? You typically talk about the approvals that you might have to get, like the IRB approval for human subjects. If you're working with vertebrate animals, it might have to be, the institutional committee on use and care of animals and that kind of thing. If you're working with certain kinds of, not devices, but certain kinds of substances, cocaine, TNT, and small amounts, obviously. But you may have to have some, at Purdue, we have something called Radiological and Environmental Management Group that you have to go through to make sure that you're handling all those things and storing all those things and dealing with all those things properly. You also typically, for procedures, you may also talk a little bit about how you're going to manage the data, how you're going to retain the data, and those kinds of things. In qualitative research, typically you do talk about access, just like we did in quant. Oftentimes you'll talk about triangulation. That is, in qualitative research, there's this unique concept called triangulation, in which you try to elicit findings. When you have a finding that emerges in multiple data sources, typically 3 is what you're trying to get, that gives solidity or gives greater trustworthiness to your findings. So you talk about that. You usually talk about approvals again, data management and retention again. But another thing that's unique to qualitative data is also, this is usually where you talk about how are you going to record the narratives of people talking, because the qualitative research is a lot of words, right? It's people's stories, it's people talking. And so the question is, how are you going to record that? How are you going to transcribe that? And there are different philosophies on, what's the appropriate approach or how you should do that. But nevertheless, that's something you talk about there. And then in things and stuff, relative to procedures, you may talk about instruments, accuracy, how you're going to test, and maybe how many times you're going to test. Like I said in the beginning of this, I said things and stuff. Sometimes it's just you test it once, it either works or it doesn't work. Moving on to analysis of the data. In quantitative sphere, you're typically talking about the statistical tools. You oftentimes talk about the validity of those tools. And the statistical tools that you choose are based upon the data types of the variables that you're working with. Nominal, interval, sorry, it's been a while since I've done this. Nominal, interval, ratio, and I'm missing one. So you basically have categorical, right? So categories, you have ranking, right? You have intervals and you have ratio. I won't get into it. But anyway, those things drive the statistical tools that you use. In qualitative, you typically talk about how are you going to analyze the words. And this could be both from kind of a content standpoint, but also from a standpoint of tools that you might use to help do that, even if your tool is as simple as Post-it notes and those kinds of things. But in qualitative, when you talk about word analysis, one of the most common is something called thematic analysis. But there are others, right? So there's narrative analysis, there's discord analysis, there's grounded theory, and each of the different types of frameworks, and one that I'm most familiar with is phenomenology, because that's what my dissertation was in, or what the kind of framework that I used in my dissertation. It just depends. So essentially, that's what you talk about in this section. And then lastly, for things and stuff in this section of analysis of data, you typically talk about calibration, accuracy and appropriateness of your tools. And when we talk about all of this, I would say actually in the analysis of data, you probably in all cases, and I didn't write it down here, in all cases you kind of deal with the issue of reliability and validity. Reliability basically is being able to get the same measurement time and again using a particular device. Validity has to do with the fact that it's the right measure for that type of data. Right. So, and there are each of the types of data, or each of the types of research, quant, qual, things and stuff, you may deal with that in different ways. And I want to dive into, maybe I'll do a video on reliability and validity at some point, because it is, in all types of research, it's something that you have to deal with. But nevertheless, that's analysis of the data. And then the last section is, and I don't know that this is a section, but somewhere you should be implying. And I would say I take that back. In some of these types of research, it actually is specifically stated. So what are your targets? What are your findings? What are your goals? What I mean by that is, for example, in quantitative research, your measure, how you know that you have a finding or not is based upon your p-value. You set your alpha and you have a certain power, right? I'm not going to get on to the statistical, but that's how essentially, once you have a result, you're comparing everything to your alpha, and you basically compare your p-value to your alpha, and you figure out, okay, did this happen by chance alone, or did this, and that's essentially when we talk about significance in research, really what we're talking about is, did it happen by chance alone? And so when I say target or findings, that's what I'm talking about. In qualitative research, it's not a hard line. It's really emergent findings that come and are pointed to through multiple data sources, back to that idea of triangulation. And the way that you're going to do that is going to depend upon the kind of qualitative research you're doing. And then lastly, and kind of why I think this is most important, is when you do things and stuff research, you have to make sure at the outset, when you're writing your proposal, you propose at what level you're expecting that thing or that stuff to perform at. Is it just supposed to work? In other words, it's a binary situation. Either it works or it doesn't work. Or is it supposed to perform to a certain target? Let's say I'm developing an algorithm in a new language or in a new way, and I expect it to do better than the old algorithm. It would be preferable to be able to say, well, I expect it to perform 20% better than the prior algorithm, as opposed to not setting a target and then finding that, you know, your approach does exceed 20% and say, oh, well, I meant to do that. It's kind of like when people do things in stuff research, I encourage them to do just like you would do in traditional quantitative research. You know, in quantitative research that as I've been describing it here, if I were to basically establish my alpha after I've collected data, that would be seen as invalid. Research misconduct in some cases. Well, I would suggest that when you're doing things in stuff research, if you're not putting a target out there of performance expectation, it's just like fudging a p-value. So I would encourage those of you who do things in stuff research to actually set that again at the beginning. So this is my quick overview of the methodology chapter. And again, as much as is possible, you want to try to solidify the details in each of these areas. But sometimes I know as graduate students are developing their proposal and getting started and trying to set the targets for what they're going to do in their thesis or dissertation, some of this is still squishy. And that's, at least in my mind, it's okay too. Now, you may have a major professor who, or you know, a chair or advisor or whatever you want to call them, who are expecting you to have all the details solidified. I think it's somewhat unrealistic because some of it's a dialogue, some of it's a negotiation between you and your committee. So I don't know how in the world that you could establish all of this to the detail. Now, what typically happens is you write chapter 3 of the 3 chapters. That is chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. That is introduction, literature review, and methodology. Of those 3 chapters, the one that's likely going to change the most when you get ready to do your final thesis or dissertation would be chapter 3, because you know a lot of those details solidify as you're doing it, and really the methodology chapter is an ideal. That is, it's kind of like a theoretical, hopeful ideal that. But the reality is anytime you do research, stuff happens, and you kind of have to accommodate that, so you never hit that totally perfect utopian ideal, right? Nevertheless, so that's chapter 3. Hopefully you're finding these videos useful. Drop me a line, or if I can help you in some way, I'm more than willing to do that. And where we go from here after the research, and I still have several topics that I still want to cover in the research series here, so I'm not stopping that, but kind of scratching my head on what I'm going to do next, but I guess I will figure that out. So I'm Jamie Moeller, Grad Connection. I hope you're finding it useful. Have a great day. Bye-bye.